All right, good afternoon. Apologies for the delay, which is just my usual tardiness. A couple of trip announcements, some near and one near, one far. In terms of distance, we will start with the fact that the Secretary General will leave New York on the evening of Friday, the 25th of August, that is tomorrow, for a trip that will take him to Kuwait, Israel, and the state of Palestine. His first stop will be in Kuwait, where on Sunday he will meet with the Amir, Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmed Al-Jaber Al-Sabah, and other senior government officials. In his meetings, the Secretary General plans to discuss the situation in the region, as well as to thank Kuwait for its tremendous generosity for humanitarian causes. Later that evening, the Secretary General will travel to Israel and to Palestine, where he will meet with the Israeli and Palestinian leadership to discuss the prospects of reviving the peace process. He will also engage with civil society and university leaders and visit an UNRWA facility. The Secretary General will be back here in New York late on the evening of the 30th. And a related note, the UN Coordinator for Humanitarian Aid and Development Activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, Robert Piper, today released an additional $2.5 million from the Humanitarian Fund for the occupied Palestinian territory to cover urgent needs in the Gaza Strip. Part of the funds will go towards the UN's emergency operation to supply fuel to nearly 200 critical health, water, and sanitation installations in Gaza. Virtually all 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza benefit from the fuel operation. The Gaza Strip is in its fourth month of serious energy crisis, with the power supply to homes and services having barely covered 25% needs of the last 6 weeks. Hospitals are operating almost 24/7 on generators not designed to be used continuously. More information online. And in terms of travel closer to home, later this afternoon, the Secretary General will travel downtown to meet with New York City Mayor de Blasio at City Hall. We expect the discussion to center around local level implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in an urban setting, including climate change. The Secretary General will, of course, also thank the Mayor for New York's strong support to the United Nations as our host city. And I have a note on Myanmar. We welcome the release of the comprehensive report of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State and take note of its emphasis on issues related to identity and citizenship, particularly its call for freedom of movement for all people, as well as the need to address the root causes of violence and reduce intercommunal violence. We look forward to reviewing the report's recommendations further. In the meantime, we would like to acknowledge again the significance of the government's establishment of this commission and the importance of its mandate to analyze the situation of all communities in Rakhine State and draft recommendations towards conflict prevention, reconciliation, institution building, and long-term development, as well as humanitarian services. The UN stands ready to support the government's implementation of the recommendations for the betterment of all communities in Rakhine State. And back here, the Security Council met on South Sudan this morning. The Assistant Secretary General for Peacekeeping Operation, El Gassim Wane, said that while the national dialogue has made some progress, achieving inclusivity and a free and secure environment remains a challenge. He reiterated that the conflict in South Sudan is a man-made one for which the leaders of the country bear direct responsibility. But he said the same leaders can also bring it back from the impending abyss. All that is needed is genuine political will to halt military operation, peacefully negotiate, and make the compromises necessary to achieve sustainable peace. He said it is crucial that the leaders of South Sudan hear the international community's unified demand of what is expected of them. And the Secretary General's Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan, Nicholas Haysom, added that the battlefield fortunes continue to inform the calculus of both the government and its opponents. He said that alongside its military pacification efforts, the government is creating an appearance of reconciliation efforts. He also stressed that the prevailing insecurity, population displacement, and lack of appropriate institution is an increasingly divided ethnic environment, militate against organizing credible elections within a year, and may well contribute to deepening and extending the conflict. And from Iraq, our humanitarian colleagues tell us that military operations continue in Iraq's TELAFAR, with the number of civilians fleeing the city having dropped from 2,000 people per day earlier this month to around 100 people yesterday. It's not clear whether this sharp drop is a reflection of the reduced population of TELAFAR or if civilians are unable to leave. All people who have fled received aid as soon as they reached assembly points outside of the city. And in next door Syria, there are still 11 besieged areas, home to more than 500,000 people, where there is no humanitarian relief and no freedom of movement for civilians. And that's according to Jan Egeland, the special advisor to Stéphane de Mistura. And Mr. Egeland added today in speaking to the press that while 8 of these areas have been reached by aid workers, 3 have not been reached at all. He voiced hope that convoys will soon reach 2 of the areas not reached so far, Barza and Kabun, with facilitation letters from the government having been received. He called it heartbreaking that some 12,000 people in Fua and Kefraya were not reached last week, appealing to the humanity of those besieging the areas to let relief be delivered to women and children. Mr. Egeland noted that the Daesh-held 5 neighborhoods of Raqqa is an area where the needs are beyond belief and where protection concerns are acute. Some 20,000 civilians are believed to be in an area, but there is no way for them to escape. You can read the full remarks of his remarks, as well as those of Ramzi Azzedine Ramzi, the Deputy Special Envoy for Syria. And our colleagues at UNHCR today released a report showing a decline in the number of refugees and migrants arriving in Europe this year. However, the agency warned that many migrants are still resorting to being transported by smugglers and trafficking networks, risking death, serious abuse, or both. Overall, Mediterranean crossings fell sharply in the first half of this year, compared with the same period due to 94% decline in people using the sea route from Turkey into Greece. Meanwhile, crossings from North Africa to Italy have remained at about the same level as last year, 83,752 people as of the end of June. The report says an estimated 2,253 people died or went missing at sea, and at least 40 died on land routes or near European borders. The UN Refugee Agency calls for renewed commitment to ensure protection and solutions, including concrete steps to address smuggling and trafficking. And I wanted to flag that in Nigeria, the Secretary General's Special Envoy for Road Safety, Jean Todt, today called on African countries to scale up their efforts to tackle road fatalities, noting that the continent has the highest rate of traffic-related deaths in the world. In Nigeria alone, 35,000 people die each year in traffic accidents. Speaking at a lecture series in Abuja on federal road safety, Mr. Todd said that if changes are not made, road fatalities are expected to increase exponentially in Nigeria, and stressed the need for a strong political will and governance, as well as those cross-sectoral support that make significant achievements in the future. Halas. Mr. Klein.
Yes, actually 2 questions. First is a very quick one. Does the Secretary General intend to visit Gaza?
At this point, all I can share with you is what I've shared with you.
Okay. And the second is going to be a bit longer. As you know, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination issued a 2-page decision. It was released publicly yesterday, invoking a rather unusual procedure of early action and urgent warning in relation to Charlottesville. And the chairperson said in an interview with the New York Times that consideration should be given to some limitations on freedom of expression when it comes to neo-Nazi expression of views, racist chants, etc.
Okay, I'm happy to hear the question.
Well, the question is, I know the Secretary General made some general remarks last week, but I'd like to know whether he agrees that Charlottesville, as opposed to flashpoints around the world that have not merited this urgent warning procedure. Does he agree that Charlottesville did merit that, invoking that procedure? And does he agree that there should be some constraints, and I don't mean in the U.S. specifically, but some constraints on so-called hate speech, legal constraints?
First of all, it's not for the Secretary General to comment on statements or procedures made by the human rights mechanism, special rapporteurs, or other committees. The human rights mechanism as it exists is a critical part of the UN system and the UN's work in upholding human rights. What the Secretary General believes, and what he said, I think, in a tweet, that everywhere and anywhere we need to stand up against racism, against bigotry, and against xenophobia, and that has been his, I will almost say, his lifelong work, and it's a message that he has repeated over and over again. He will continue to repeat, no matter where, in what country that may happen.
Has he issued any denunciation, for example, of Sudan, where the reports of modern slavery persisting?
I think a statement where the Secretary General says we need to stand up against racism, xenophobia, discrimination everywhere and anywhere, I think, to me, is universal.
But that's very generic. I mean,
I think it's universal, and wherever it happens, we should and need to stand up against it. Mr. Lee.
Sure. I wanted to ask you about Yemen. Yesterday I'd asked you about that airstrike, and you'd said that the UN Human Rights Mechanism is looking into it. Do you have any casualty figures? And I also wanted to ask you about noted advocate and Sana'a resident Hisham al-Omaisi, who's been missing now for 10 days. People say he's in Houthi custody. And I'm wondering whether anyone in the UN system, since the envoy apparently can't speak to the Houthis, or they won't speak to him, has anyone in the UN system requested the release of Mr.
his
Omaisi?
situation. I will check up on it. I don't have any update from our colleagues in Yemen on casualties.
But I guess more substantively, is this, and I understand the Security Council is calling for all parties to speak to the envoy, but given that it's now been several months that the side in control of Sana'a said they won't speak to him, they don't view him as independent or impartial, is this a downside to not having an envoy that can speak to both sides? Who in the UN system has asked for the release of Hisham al-Omaisi?
The Secretary General's envoy speaks to as many parties as possible and is getting the input of all the parties.
Could you get back on this case?
If I get something, I will get back to you. Stefano, then Olga.
Thank you, Stéphane. Today in Rome, hundreds of refugees from Eritrea and some also from Ethiopia that were living in a building, occupying a building. They've been removed by the police, but apparently, there was violence going on. And UNICEF in Italy said that many children were involved, and it was like a situation where it was actually very dangerous for these people. So there is any comment coming from Secretary General for a situation that is getting...
we don't have the details of the situation. I think the images that we saw were disturbing. We hope that any and all of these police operations are done in order to ensure the full respect of the rights of migrants as people. Thank you. Olga, and then Dulcie.
Thanks, Steph. About this proposal from Geneva from Mr. Egelan on humanitarian pauses in Raqqa, if it's possible, have you heard anything back from those on the ground about the implementation of that?
We have not, and I think Mr. Egelan and their team would be the first ones to hear through the various coordination mechanisms that exist in Geneva. But if we hear something, I will let you know, but I have not. Dulcie.
Thanks. So what is the budget for the new Office of the Victim Advocate? Is that in the UN Secretariat, or is that in the Peacekeeping Department?
It's a good question. Let me just double check. I know she's at the Assistant Secretary General level. Let me double check before I speak. I speak out of turn.
Okay.
Hi. Guatemala has announced that President Morales is coming tomorrow to meet the ESG. Do you know what time and what issues they expect to discuss?
The meeting, we did receive a request for a meeting from the presidency of Guatemala. We have informed them of the Secretary General's availability at tomorrow afternoon. We've not heard back an official confirmation. I haven't got anything this morning. I think as to why they have to have the meeting, you should ask them. Obviously, you know what we've said yesterday concerning the situation in Guatemala. Mr. Barada.
Thank you, Steph. So the Secretary General carrying a specific message to Kuwait. Why Kuwait, not other countries in the region? And so since he's going to see most likely in a month or so the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the Palestinian Authority, is he going to promote or to provide any proposals to revive the peace process? So can you tell us more about this visit? Thanks.
Two things. On the visit to Kuwait, he has not yet been to Kuwait. As you know, for various logistics reasons, Kuwait's not a place he's already visited. He's been to most of the countries in the Gulf. He's been to Saudi Arabia. He's been to the UAE. He's been to Oman. He's been to Qatar. Kuwait is a country he had wanted to visit but had not been able to. Obviously, Kuwait plays a very important role in the region, notably currently on its mediation efforts towards resolving the crisis in the Gulf. Also having an important role in Iraq and other areas in the region. And as I said, to thank the Kuwaitis for their support for UN's humanitarian work. On the visit to Israel and Palestine, I think the issue is obviously an important issue on the UN's agenda. It's important for the Secretary General, I think, to go to visit both places early in his tenure. He will be reiterating the UN's commitment to providing Israelis and Palestinians with all possible support to reach a comprehensive two-state solution as the only option for realizing the national aspirations of both peoples.
On Togo, why does the UN is being quiet on the ongoing political fight in the country?
We're obviously keeping a close eye on the region, on the country. The Secretary General's representative in the region, regional representative, is expected to go in early September to Togo. Mr. Chambas is expected to visit Togo in early September, so we should have more then. Yes, sir. No, not you. You I don't call sir.
Two things. Do you have any details on how the airport blockage in South Sudan, the situation there was resolved? And back to Guatemala, you mentioned yesterday that there's been reports that the president is going to ask for the removal of the head of the anti-corruption committee. Is removing Velasquez something that the Secretary General would consider at all?
Well, I think, as we said yesterday, we fully support Mr. Velasquez and the very important work that the Commission does. On South Sudan, there were discussions with the authorities who rightfully so control their airspace. South Sudan is a sovereign country, so we need clearances for those flights. Discussions were had on the ground, and the issue was resolved. Mr. Avni.
Two questions.
Sir.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Two questions on the trip. First on Kuwait, does the Secretary General seek a role for the UN in resolving the Saudi, Qatari, or the Gulf crisis, as you called it, disputes? Secondly, on his trip to Israel and Palestine, does he? Is it coincidence that it happens at the same time that Jared Kushner is there doing mediation of his own?
Yes, it's coincidence.
Was it planned before?
It's been in discussion for a few weeks, so it is a matter of pure calendaring coincidence. On the Gulf crisis, the Secretary General is not seeking any role. I think he's expressed his support for the regional efforts that are ongoing. And as a matter of principle, should his good officers be needed and be requested by the parties, he remains available. And that's a statement of principle. But we're not seeking anything. Oleg, sorry, yeah?
But suffice it to say that he's there. He will talk with the Kuwaitis about their.
I'm sure. I would not be surprised if the issue came up.
And one more follow-up on Joe's question. Actually, two. One, you didn't answer his question about the Secretary General's position on limitation to expressions of hate or whatever it is. And secondly, does the Secretary General believe that there's a rise of Nazism and that kind of political that it's sufficient to warrant a maybe even UN intervention in the United States?
Nobody's talking about any UN intervention in the United States. That being said, on a serious note, I think the Secretary General, since coming into office, has noted the rise in many countries, of xenophobia and of intolerance and of racism, and has spoken out strongly against it. You'd asked another question, which I've now forgotten. No, the right to free speech and right to expression is a fundamental human right, but there are also aspects of incitement to hate and incitement speech that need to be taken into account. Well, no, you may not. Go ahead.
Thanks, Stéphane.
You have the right to speak, but at the time I ask you to speak. So that's your fundamental right. Yes?
On the trip to Middle East, so when exactly is the SG going to arrive to Israel and Palestine?
He'll be, basically the bulk of the Israel-Palestine program will be Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday.
All right. And also on South Sudan, could you provide the numbers of how many SPLA and opposition members are currently in Eastern DRC, and what's happening with the discussions on their possible repatriation?
Not at this point, but I can get you something right after the briefing. Yeah. Did you have a question? Yeah. Did you? Okay, go ahead. Oh, it was answered. That's like questions I like. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Yassine Najjar. We're talking about a situation in Syria. Do you have any issue about that, or they're talking about that? It's right now, next week, and we have in holidays still the war on, and bombing on in Damascus around,
Well, you may have gone out on your break when I was speaking, but I highlighted what the very eloquent words of Jan Egeland on his extreme concern at the continuing violence that the civilians are bearing the brunt of in various parts of Syria, and his call for all those who are besieging areas to allow humanitarian aid to get through to those who desperately need it. Monsieur.
Merci,
No,
Stéphane.
you're not Monsieur. But I will get to you, Joe. Don't worry.
Stéphane, on UNIFIL mandate in Lebanon, earlier this month, Antonio Gutierrez said that he wrote a letter to see the way to improve the Blue Helmet mandate. Did he arrive to a conclusion? Any recommendation?
Well, that's a discussion that's ongoing in the Security Council on the renewal of the mandate of UNIFIL. I think the Secretary General has made his views known. It is now up to the member states to come up to a consensus. Mr. Klein.
Okay. I can now exercise my right of free
right,
expression? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I just want to further follow up because we're still trying to discern if the Secretary General has an opinion where the appropriate line should be between permissible expression of views, even if controversial, and racist hate speech where she thinks goes over the line and perhaps should be restricted in accordance with international law. Could you be a little bit more specific?
Those are issues that national jurisdictions have grappled with and have come up with some with issues. I think people have a right to express themselves. When those expression, enticement to hate leads to violence and death, then it obviously becomes a great concern. Mr. Lee, and then we'll go.
Sure. I want to ask you about Myanmar and then about an event here in the UN. On Myanmar, a number of times when asked about whether the Secretary General was going to speak to Aung San Suu Kyi or was concerned about the UN experts being banned from going in, you said you were waiting for the Kofi Annan RAKHINE Commission to finish. It's now finished and made a number of recommendations. I wanted to know number one, what does the UN think of the report? Is it now time for the UN to more directly call for the entry of the UN team into the country? And is the UN going to be working on the recommendations in the Annan plan, or has the UN essentially lost its...
Matthew, it's unlike you, but I did read a whole thing about what we thought of the plan and what
then
the
let me
next
get to the
steps
second
were.
one.
So
my mind is elsewhere.
All right. That's all right.
I'll go back over the transcript on that. What I wanted to ask you about is I'd asked you previously about an event, but this is a number of times I'd asked you about Carlos Garcia, who used to be the former permanent representative of El Salvador. Mm-hmm. And in the Eng Lap Seng case, he was shown to have assisted in the laundering of money between Eng Lap Seng and Francis Lorenzo. So I wanted to ask you, there's an event tomorrow in Ikosak, which is sponsored by a group which is linked online and in its founding with Carlos Garcia. And it's listed in a press release that was put out yesterday with the Secretary General meaning to attend the
What's the event?
The event is, I'll read you the full title. It's one of these long ones. It's called Road to the Future of Sustainable Development, Moving from Commitments to Results Through Inclusive Innovation. And it has a press release by the group WOCG talking about life pods, and it says there will be a statement by Antonio Guterres. So my question is, has this group, including its links to in its very founding, to Carlos Garcia and Francis Lorenzo, been vetted by the UN?
Let me check. I'm not aware of the Secretary General participating. I will look into
whether or not he participates. I guess my question is, given that these exhibits,
I'm not aware of the event, so I will look into the event.
Okay, last time you didn't answer it, just got
I did
canceled.
answer you.
Well, yeah, that evening when the NGO asked you to
I answered you. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Monsieur.
On the peace process in the Middle East, the current U.S. administration seems to be not backing anymore the two-state solution. So is this something that's gonna make it hard for the UN to keep on this peace process?
I have trouble enough speaking for the UN. I will let the U.S. speak for itself and let you interpret it. For the Secretary General, the only feasible solution is a two-state solution, and that's what he will be. That's the message he will keep reiterating. Mr. Barada and then Dulce.
Yesterday, the U.S. ambassador described the situation in southern Lebanon as growing more dangerous because of Hezbollah's arms, according to her statement. Do you share, from the UN perspective, the same assessment with the U.S. ambassador? Second, on the fight along the border between the Lebanese army and Daesh, do you have anything to say on that? Thank you.
Nothing on your second question. As for UNIFIL, I think UNIFIL is very transparent in how it fulfills its mandate. It has a very clear mandate with limitations, and it follows that mandate. I think this year there's been no incident involving hostile activity from the UNIFIL area of operations or any breach of cessation of hostilities between Lebanon and Israel. We've reported whatever isolated instances when unauthorized weapons were observed, and UNIFIL reports as it's due to report. The member states are right now discussing the renewal of its mandate, and we'll wait to see what happens. Dulce, 1 second, Benny.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the next step by the Secretary General to address the investigation of the 2 UN experts in the Congo. What is the next step, and does it require approval from the Security Council, whatever he decides?
I think there are discussions ongoing within the Secretariat, and obviously it's a discussion that's being had with Security Council members as to what form a follow-up mechanism will be established. It's important that justice be had for the sake of our 2 colleagues who were murdered. And what shape that follow-up mechanism will take will be announced in due course. But those discussions are ongoing. Mr. Benny.
I like Mr. Benny. Following up on Ali's question, so the other thing that Haley said was that UNIFIL isn't pursuing its mission aggressively. Is it your contention or UNIFIL's contention that it is pursuing its mission aggressively?
It is pursuing its mission according to its mandate. Mr. Lee, then Stefano.
Sure. I wanted to ask you, I saw that this is dangerous. You may have actually given this readout as well while I was thinking about this event, but Feltman, Jeffrey Feltman, being in Somalia, have you spoken of that?
No, I don't have anything.
Okay, so I wanted to ask, he's there. They're tweeting pictures of him with Farmajo, but what I wanted to know is, given that he's so close to Kenya, and is he, where else has he gone on this trip? I was unaware that he was there, and can we get some kind of a readout of this trip, and whether or not it will include Kenya, and if you have any update, as more and more people are saying that the results that were put online don't line up with what was announced and what the Secretary General congratulated. Is there any updated statement by the UN concerning the election in Kenya?
Not from us here. There's a calendar which is playing itself out, and there are institutions that are at work on this. And I'll see what I can get you on Mr. Feldman.
And on the visit this afternoon to City Hall, it might seem like a strange thing, but there was a debate last night between Bill de Blasio and Sal Albanese. It's an election season here.
Yeah.
Is it the UN? I often hear them say that they don't sort of engage with incumbents while there's a contest, or they might. Is there any attempt by the Secretary General to reach Mr. Albanese or any of the other candidates, or is this a question?
He's meeting with the mayor of the city of New York, and I'm not aware of the Secretary General having any contacts with any of the candidates from the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, or any other party who are running for the right to sit and work in City Hall. Stefano.
Question. Can I? One is about the waves of migrants and refugees in the Mediterranean. The data says that in August, actually, the numbers of those waves toward Italy, they went down, but like a lot. And one of the reasons say because now the Libyans are able to stop the traffickers. In this case, of course, those refugees will be pushed back in Libya. But other data says that were published in Italy say because actually also in those camps that there are in Libya, the UN that now is monitoring them is offering economic incentive to for them to return in their countries. Do you know anything about this?
I'm not aware of the UN offering economic incentives for people to return home, but you can check with UNHCR. The numbers that I just gave a few minutes ago from UNHCR said the crossings North Africa to Italy have remained at around the same level as last year. So that's the numbers.
This month, you mean, in August?
The levels this year so far.
This year. The data is they're talking about this month of August that they went down. Okay. Well, and then the second question is maybe you think it's not related to the UN, but I think it is. In the meeting that the Secretary General is going to have today with the Mayor Bill de Blasio, do you think they're going to talk about this debate that's going on in the United States, but now it reached the city, about the statues, the opportunity to take off statues, like, for example, there was the talk about the Christopher Columbus statue.
I
tell you what I think is relevant, because it's to do with not only with the history of this country or any country, but heritage affects people. And the question is, because there was just reporting that the mayor de Blasio said that he's on the table a discussion.
No, I'm aware of the story.
So do you think that Secretary General should address this
I don't
issue?
expect it to come up. Mr. Klein.
Thank you. On UNIFIL.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that, in your view, UNIFIL is carrying out its mandate. I just want to ask about the scope of the mandate. If a member state, using Israel as an example, should report to UNIFIL its information that there are concealed weapons in southern Lebanon, in houses or mosques or schools, not visible to the naked eye, but it gathered intelligence on that. Would the mandate include UNIFIL sending out proactively inspectors to follow up on that information?
What I can tell you is that UNIFIL's mandate does not authorize accessing private property unless there's a credible evidence of a violation of Resolution 1701 and an imminent threat of hostile activity emanating from that specific location. Where information regarding suspected presence of illicit weapons in privately owned areas is received, UNIFIL works closely with the Lebanese armed forces and the Lebanese authorities to verify the information. Lebanese authorities have the primary responsibility for ensuring that there are no unauthorized weapons in the area between the Litani River and the Blue Line.
But if the Lebanese authorities are heavily influenced by Hezbollah, which has been accused of concealing such weapons, not only in private residences, but in schools, hospitals, mosques. Is that what you're saying is that it's just delegated out to the Lebanese authorities?
No, what I'm saying is that the Lebanese authorities have the primary responsibility. Mr. Lee, and then, sorry, Dulcie.
Sure, I want to ask you on South Sudan. There's a very specific. The UN's own Radio Maria has confirmed that a WFP plane crashed into a house and a child was killed. So obviously that's a tragedy. But what I wanted to ask you about is it quotes the UN's Adnan Khan said the UN would provide support to the grieving family, which is commendable. I don't know if it means financial support, and if it does, that's also good. But obviously people, for example, in Haiti are left wondering, how is the decision made when a death is said to be attributable to the UN, people being compensated or not being compensated?
I think there are two different issues. The issue surrounding Haiti has been litigated. Our position has been clear. Our focus right now is on combating cholera in Haiti and giving support to those communities impacted. WFP has confirmed that a 5-year-old girl was killed when one of its planes that had just done some airdrops landed at the airport in very bad weather. It's extended its condolences to the family, and it will provide all possible support to them. An official investigation is underway, and the aircraft will be carefully reviewed to discover why it was so low. It was an Ilyushin 76 cargo plane, and it hit a tree and the metal roof of a single-story house as it tried to land at Juba Airport in what has been described as very low visibility and heavy rain.
It's definitely a tragedy. I guess what my question is, are you referring to litigation? Is it like if this family litigated, then they wouldn't be compensated?
I think the case.
I understand. Is there a SOFA in place? Is there a status of forces agreement with a compensation?
There's a SOFA. There's a SOFA in place, and obviously there needs to be an investigation. What WFP is doing is providing some immediate support, and then it will run its course. Dulcie.
Yeah, just to follow up on Joe Klein's question. So as a matter of course, does the Israeli government inform UNIFIL of information it knows about arms smuggling? I mean, is there
I think there are. First of all, it sounds like it's a question for the Israeli military. There are regular coordination meetings between the UN, the Lebanese Armed Forces, and the IDF, and information is communicated. Yes, sir.
Just a follow-up about Qatar. Qatar today, they said they're going to have a normal relationship with Iran. That's what we heard today in the news. Don't you think that's going to put Qatar in a little trouble in that?
it's up to Qatar to analyze the impact of its diplomatic actions. What is important for the Secretary General is that the current ongoing crisis in the Gulf be resolved. Thank you.